crowd. Just one moment. Okay. It's a pretty international crowd. Why? Because this is the co-sponsored by the International Media Management Academic Association, a group of professorial type, mostly research types on media management. And that is convening annually, and also during the year has this seminar series as well as other activities. And we are, it is co-sponsored with the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, CITI, at Columbia University in New York. We're happy that you are joining us. And here for the topic that we are going to be talking about today, which is, just a second, let me introduce the topic. Namely, those of you in America certainly have noticed that 2 days ago we had an election. It was not kind of the election, but it was kind of interesting enough. There was a shift. I suppose one can say that the shift to the right somewhat. This has led to a lot of social media action, which is sharply divided posts online between Democrats, those Democrats that believe that the Democrats went too progressive to the left, and those who believe that they didn't deliver enough progressive policy to mobilize the base. And it is also sharply divided among Republicans, those Republicans who believe that Trump's views have been winning over the working class, and those who think that without Trump, they're winning over the suburban middle class that abandoned them a year ago. So there's a huge conversation, or maybe more like a shouting match, that is taking place online. And so the question is, how do such conversations online affect the news in more traditional media, and vice versa, in some giant feedback loop, and whether the traditional media take their cues from social media. And here too, one can view this either of the question whether elites should or do in fact set the news and the agenda, and if not, whether it should be grassroots democracy in action, if you like the results, of course, or whether it's woke rants or populist rants, if you don't like it. So this is the political background. We understand that. It's kind of hard to miss. But there's also the economic dimension to all this, to the news organizations' incentive structure, media competition, and how it affects selection of stories and information, subscription media versus advertising-supported media, two-sided markets, principal agents issues, and so on. And so we're here very fortunate to have Julia Cagé here, and I have to really speed this up because if I don't charge my phone, my computer, it's going to go to sleep. Julia Cagé is an economist from Paris with a doctorate in economics from Harvard. She will give us an empirical analysis and hopefully also the underlying economic interpretation, and maybe also the forward look into the implications. Julia is an associate professor at Sciences Po in Paris. She has been promoted to associate professor for economics with tenure this year. Congratulations. She is also a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research there, and in the Laboratory for Interdisciplinary Evaluation of Public Policies. And she, interestingly enough, for this context here, she's a board member of Agence France Presse, the third largest international news agency in the world. Among her publications are many articles already in major journals, but also 3 books. One of them, Saving the Media, Capitalism, Crowdfunding, and Democracy. 2015 was translated in 11 different languages, got prizes and all kinds of recognition and awards. She's also written the other 2 books that I will translate into English, The Information at Any Price, and the information is a public good. And so those are 3 books that she's written and got a lot of recognition. I can tell you a lot of more about her accomplishments, but I think it's more important to hear from her. So here, go ahead, Julia. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And thanks for the great introduction to this project, Social Media and Newsroom Production Decisions. This is a joint work with Nicolas Hervé and with Béatrice Mazoyer, who is attending the talk online. So Eli already introduced and motivate the talk in a sense. I also have like a small motivation slide. Basically, we know, and there is a huge literature both in like political economy and political science on the importance of access to information on electoral outcomes, as well as on political accountability. And there is more and more evidence about the fact that social media have a huge impact on the way we consume news. There is obviously all the growing literature that focus on the issue of fake news, but it might also affect not only participation into elections, but also protest participation and corruption. What we want to study more specifically here with Nicolas and Béatrice is the fact that not only social media affect the way in which news is consumed, but it might also affect the way in which news is produced, and in particular, the way in which news is produced by traditional media outlets. And so the specific question we tackle in this work is whether news editors are influenced in their editorial and production decisions by the popularity of stories on social media. And at the end of the day, so that would be more complicated, let's say, to completely answer, but at the end of the day, obviously, what we want to think about is the overall welfare effect of the introduction of social media. So how can we know whether news editors are influenced by story popularity on social media? Here we are going to focus on a specific social media, which is Twitter, for a good reason, because we have a lot of evidence that is telling us that journalists use Twitter a lot, and some journalists even say that they find Twitter more informative than Associated Press. So we focus on Twitter, and we are going to first build a new data set to have, let's say, a screenshot of everything that is happening on Twitter at a given moment of time. So we did that with French data. So we built a representative sample of all the tweets produced in French during an entire year. At the end of the day, we have 70% of all the tweets produced in French. So we do not have everything, but I guess what we have is better than what has been done in the literature until now, in particular because it was collected without imposing any structure on the data collection. So, for example, we are not going to consider just like tweets about Brexit or tweets about politics. We know what is happening on Twitter. We are going to do that for 1 year. So from August 2018 to July 2019, at the end of the day, we have around 1.8 billion tweets with information on the tweet. So we have the length, the number of words. We have both original tweets and retweets, replies, quote. And we also have popularity of the tweet, in particular, the number of retweets, likes, and replies it gets. For each tweet, we collect information on the Twitter user who tweeted it. So we have time invariant characteristics, such as the year of the account creation, but also time variant characteristics. So overall, in our dataset, we have around 4.3 million Twitter users. So we have measure of their activity. So for example, the number of times I've tweeted, the first time we observe them. We know where they are located, and in particular, because we're going to look at French media, whether they are located in France or abroad. whether their account is verified. We compute manually using a number of different strategies information on whether the account is the account of a journalist or the account of a media outlet. We have measure of user popularity. In particular, we define, I'm going to come back to that, a measure of the user centrality, relying on the PageRank algorithm. And we also compute manually from the short bio description that is given by the users, information about their job and profession. So what we're interested in is to know whether what is happening on Twitter is going to influence what is happening on traditional media. So what do we do? Here we built on our previous work with Nicolas Hervé, where we have studied the propagation of information online for French media. Historically, we did that in 2013. So we do the same thing here for 2018, 2019. We try to collect data on the universe of French general information news media, independently of their offline format. So we are going to collect all the news articles put online by the website of local newspapers, national newspapers, TV stations, radio channels, as well as data on the dispatch published on the one hand by the Agence France Presse, and on the other hand, all the dispatched published in French by the news agency Reuters. So this gives us a screenshot of what is happening on traditional media outlets. We obtain around 4 million news articles, and for each article, we are also going to compute measures of their popularity. In terms of data, the last thing I want to quickly highlight is the following. So one of the interesting aspects of our work is that we have this huge data set, 1.8 billion tweets, 4 million news articles. And we know that in the economics literature, there is a lot of concern about what is called specification search or publication bias, where basically, you play a lot around with all your specifications before obtaining something with statistical significance. So we decided to tackle this issue directly by following a split sample approach. So everything that I am going to present to you today is based on 4 months of data from August 2018 to November 2018. This is on this subsample of data that we are going to define all the empirical strategy and specifications we want to test. And then at the end of the day, for for the final publication, we're going to give all the data to a data editor that will just click on the code and see what we obtain with the 8 months of remaining data. So we have this information from Twitter, and we have this information from traditional media. And what we need to understand is how the two interact. To do that, we are going to rely on a number of topic detection algorithm, both on social and on mainstream media, to build joint news events. So what is joint news events? This is going to be a set of documents, including tweets and media articles that talk about the same news stories. I'm trying to be short here, but if you want to discuss the methodology later on, I would be very happy to do so, as well as Beatrice, who is attending the talk and who did most of the job. At the end of the day, we have a little bit more than 6,000 joint events, out of which 5,700 emerged first on Twitter. So for these joint events, and in particular for those news stories that originate first on Twitter, we want to know whether their popularity affects the coverage traditional media are going to devote to the story. And we're going to consider both the extensive and the intensive margins of the media coverage. So both the number of articles that are published, and then the length of these articles and the characteristics of these articles. Obviously, doing so is complicated by the fact that there is a lot of endogeneity. It is not because I'm going to show you a positive correlation between what is happening on Twitter and what is happening on traditional media, then that Twitter has any impact on traditional media. In particular, you can see a story with a lot of activity on Twitter and a lot of news articles on traditional media. And this could just be due to the fact that the story is newsworthy, something important is happening, and not at all to the fact that traditional media outlets are monitoring what is happening on Twitter. So what we need to have is that we need to have an exogenous source of variation, which is going to affect what is happening on Twitter, with no direct impact on what is happening on traditional media. And so we are going to propose as an instrument here the interaction between the seed of the event centrality. So the seed of the event is the first user who break out the news on Twitter. So we're going to consider the interaction between the seed of the event centrality and the social media news pressure at the time of the tweet. So let me just give you like more context on that. So for centrality, as I quickly already highlighted, we are going to use the PageRank algorithm. What is key for us is that we are going to build this measure of centrality every day. So let's say that you discover like a big scandal. Obviously, you might have much more followers and become super central in the network. And so we want to know the extent to which you were central at any given moment of time. So we are going to define it on a daily basis, simply using a 40-day rolling window. Then you might ask me, okay, centrality might be enough, because if an event is tweeted by a very central user, then it will have like more retweets, interactions on Twitter. So there would be like more popularity on Twitter. But the thing is, it's true, but centrality might also be directly linked to the monitoring of a user by traditional media outlets, for example. So it's going to violate the exclusion restriction. We have the same issue with the social media news pressure. So if you look at social media news pressure, basically we look at the time of the event of everything that is happening on Twitter, the number of retweets, replies, quote, and you know that if a lot of things are happening at a moment of point, at a moment of time on Twitter, then the visibility of your tweet is going to decrease, because you will be taken in a flow of different tweets. And if the social media news pressure is low, then you have a higher probability to be seen and retweeted by others. And so our instrument is really to use the interaction between the two. And we assume that once we control for the direct effects of centrality and of news pressure, the interaction between the seed's centrality and news pressure should only affect traditional news production through its effect on the tweet visibility on Twitter. So the intuition is the following. Like, think about central seed that tweets at a time nothing is happening on Twitter, or at a time of high Twitter news pressure. Okay. If it tweets at a time nothing is happening on Twitter, then the probability of its tweets to generate a lot of activity will be much higher than if it tweets at a time of high Twitter news pressure, because in this case, his tweet would be lost in the middle of other things. Okay. So specifically, we are going to estimate the following relationship. We want to understand the effect of what is happening on Twitter on the news coverage by traditional news media. So we are going to measure the popularity of an event on Twitter by the number of tweets published on Twitter before the publication of the first media article. And we are going to look at how this number affect the coverage by traditional media outlets, that we are going to measure both with the number of articles, their length, and their originality. We both look first at the correlation between popularity on Twitter and coverage by traditional news media, and then we instrument popularity on Twitter, the number of tweets, by the interaction between centrality and news pressure. Okay. If we first look at the naive estimate, so simply the correlation between what is happening on Twitter and what is happening on traditional media outlets, what do we see? So we see they have changed the Zoom thing, and so I cannot write on it. Okay, we say the following. If you first consider the first 5 columns, we look at the number of articles published in the event. And we see that when you have a 1% increase in the number of tweets before the first media article, we have a 9.9 percentage point increase in the number of news articles in the event. We have this effect both at the intensive margin or at the extensive margin. If you look at column 6 to 10, we see an increase in the number of different media outlets covering the event. Just if you look at columns 5 and 10, there is drop media, drop multiple. It's because we want to make sure that these findings are not driven by news event whose seed is a media outlet or a journalist. Okay, so even if you look at normal seeds, we find this positive correlation. Okay, you can do this analysis at the event level. So we have this 5,700 joint event, or you can do the same analysis at the level of each media outlet. Okay, at the level of each media outlet, you see that you have an increase in the number of articles published when you have more activity on Twitter. And then conditional on covering the event. So conditional for a media outlet on publishing at least 1 media article in the event. We see that it's going to publish more than 1 article depending on the popularity on Twitter. And we also find an increase on average in the length of the articles they are going to devote to the event and in the originality of these articles. Now, these were simple correlations, and the estimate might be biased by the fact that, for example, we are unable to measure the newsworthiness of an event here. So we need to instrument for the popularity of an event on Twitter. So as I told you before, instrument the interaction between the news pressure on Twitter and the centrality of the seed in the event. If we look at the reduced formed analysis, we find a direct effect of the instrument, the interaction between low news pressure and centrality on the number of articles published. Okay. And in fact, you see that this instrument, the interaction between low news pressure and centrality, in the first stage, there's a positive relationship with the number of tweets in the event. Okay. When you have like a more central user tweeting at a time when nothing is happening, you will have much more tweets about the event. And in the second stage, if you look at the instrumented number of tweets, we still find a positive and statistically significant relationship between this number of tweets in the event and the number of articles news media devote to the event. This is true whether you perform as before the analysis at the event level or whether you perform it at the media level, looking at each media outlet within an event. When you look at the characteristics of the articles, you see an increase in the number of the articles. But in terms of causal effect, we no longer find any statistically significant impact of the number of tweets on the length or the originality of the news media article published. So here is our main finding. So what I have shown you until now is this causal relationship between the popularity of an event on Twitter, so how many tweets basically about the news story on Twitter, and the coverage media outlets are going to devote to these news stories. So what are the mechanisms behind this finding? The first possible mechanism really comes from the fact that journalists tend to monitor Twitter. I went through a number of different surveys, and you always find the same kind of evidence. 91% of the US journalists in 2017 were considering social media as an important source of news. Some journalists think that using Twitter is as important as using headlines from the Associated Press. So we have this evidence on the fact that journalists tend to rely on Twitter. Here, what we do, here we compute for each media outlet in our sample, the number of their journalists present on Twitter. And we do find that the effect is stronger for media outlets with relatively more journalists on Twitter. So this is partly driven, at least, by the monitoring of Twitter by journalists. Now, if we turn to the economics of it, why would traditional media outlets rely on Twitter to decide about what to cover or the intensity of the coverage they want to devote to a given event? This might be driven by a click bias. Think about media outlets whose only goal would be to maximize advertising revenues, so to maximize the number of clicks. But this editor do not know exactly what will be of interest for the readers. He might simply decide to use Twitter as a signal. Okay. So if it were to be the case, we should expect to find an effect that will be stronger for media outlets that depend more on advertising revenues. And indeed, this is what we show in this table. So what we have in this table, basically, if you go from the left to the right, on the left, you will have media outlets that are super reliant on advertising revenues, the one that do not have any paywall to begin with. So all their revenues depend on advertising revenues, or the one that have a soft or a paywall, or for which you need to watch an ad before reading an article. And then if you move to the right, you have like media outlets with an hard paywall whose all revenue come from the subscription they get, and that rely much less, on the expected number of clicks they would get from an article. And what you find here is that we find that our effect is much stronger for all the media outlets that have no paywall or simply a soft paywall than for those media outlets that mostly rely on subscription. So clearly, part of our results is also driven by this click bias. The third possible explanation would be that even short-term consideration generated by advertising revenues, you are a news editor, and what you want to do is to produce news consumers are interested in. And again, we are back to this issue that editors might not know consumers' preferences. So they can just decide to use the popularity of an event on Twitter as a signal that allows them to draw inferences about these preferences. So then the question is the following. If Twitter is used as a signal, are we better informed thanks to the introduction of Twitter? And here I think we are faced with an issue. If we think about our IV strategy, our IV strategy to isolate the causal impact of a story popularity on Twitter leads us to capture the effects of a variation in popularity that is uncorrelated with the story underlying newsworthiness. So at the end of the day, we are afraid that social media may provide a biased signal of what reader wants. This is the first issue we have. The second issue we have is the following. Even if Twitter were not providing a biased signal of what readers want, the thing is, Twitter users are not representative of the general news reading population. So this is a table based on the Reuters data for the French audience, but you have exactly the same thing if you look at the UK, if you look at the US, all the countries that are surveyed by Reuters. You find, for example, that Twitter users, they tend to be younger, you have more male, they are more educated, they have higher revenues than people who do not use Twitter. So at the end of the day, it means that if you rely on Twitter to decide on your coverage, you might rely on a signal that is generated by citizens who are not representative of the overall news consuming population. And it also means that you might produce information targeted at people who are not representative of your overall news reading population. So the last thing we decided to do is the following. We find this causal effect of Twitter on coverage by traditional news media. This might create bias, in particular bias with respect to the preferences of the overall population. But let's see what we find in the data. Let's see how consumers react. And in particular, let's see whether those articles that are going to be produced by the media outlets are liked or not by the consumers. So in an ideal world, what we would like to have is data on the number of times each article is read. Unfortunately, we do not have, media outlets have, but researchers do not have access to audience data at the article level. So here we rely on our previous research, and we proxy this audience at the article level by the number of times each article is shared on Facebook. Okay, and we want to see whether the articles that are produced are more popular. If we first look at the naive estimate, so as before the correlation, but this time we are going to look at the effect of the popularity of an event on Twitter on the number of news articles produced, but we are going to look at the effect of an event popularity on Twitter on the number of times the article produced are liked by people. We find a positive relationship. But now if we control for the endogeneity of the number of tweets, and in particular, if we instrument the number of tweets by our interaction between centrality and news pressure, we do not find any effect. So contrarily to media outlets, consumers do not seem to react to a surge in popularity. Okay. So overall, here is our main finding. We think that how editors decide on the coverage for stories is essentially a black box. We try to open a little bit this black box in this research. We are, to the extent of our knowledge, the first to investigate the decision to cover a story that originates on social media, and second to look at the impact this story popularity has on the extent of the coverage. We show that there is a positive effect of stories popularity on Twitter on media coverage. We also document heterogeneity in this coverage. In particular, we show that the effect is much stronger for media outlets that rely more on advertising revenue. And we also think that we have some evidence of the fact that when journalists rely on Twitter for coverage, then it might have a negative effect on consumers' welfare, given that Twitter provides journalists with a bias signal on consumers' preferences. And we think that it might rationalize two things. The first thing, it might rationalize a huge perceived impact of social media. Even if citizens still get the majority of their news by turning on TV, if you look at US survey data, you see that people are still informed by TV more than by social media. But at the end of the day, what they see on TV might be directly influenced by what is happening on social media. And we think that it might also explain why, when you look at survey data on citizens' interest about what is published by media outlets, they tend to find part of the coverage of no interest to them. And this bias might partly rationalize this finding. So yeah, you told me 20 minutes. I guess I was a little bit too long. Sorry about that, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Julia. That was really fascinating. And I will open this to questions and comments. I will just simply ask the first one or make the first comment, and then so that you have time to think about it in the audience. It seems to me that you're describing not only a welfare loss, but also a private loss of media companies. If you think of the, and I'm not talking about the advertising driven ones, if they want to maximize their audience, to maximize advertising revenue, then they look like television, broadcast television has done traditionally, look at the ratings, okay? And the ratings are based on, in the US, let's say, on Nielsen, a certain kind of sample, but the And you'd think that the news outlets, in selecting the stories, have the data, and you said that you could not access it, but you have the indirect numbers, that they have the data from of clicks, and so they could actually make some very well-informed decisions about what is popular and what is not. Now, instead, they seem to be using also, and there's no correlation as you show, they seem to be using also the Twitter numbers, a highly underrepresentative sample, as you kind of point out yourself. Isn't this therefore pointing to economic irrationality and inefficiency in those editorial decisions, if economics is the motivator?
So the thing is, when we look at what is happening on Twitter here, we are looking at what is happening on Twitter before the first media article is published. Because basically we did not want our estimates to be biased by the fact that some news article about the event might become very popular. When we look at Facebook, we are going to look at the popularity of published news article. So whether this news article is liked. So we are not looking at the same metrics. It's not as if I was telling you, oh, they're using Twitter, but they're not using Facebook. Now, one might also think, and you are right, that because of the economic motivation, not only you are going to monitor Twitter, but you are also going to look at the statistics of the media articles you produce, and then decide to produce even more if after having published one article on the topic, you see that it's going to get a lot of clicks. So in a sense, the way you should think about our results is more as telling you that at the time when you decide whether or not to write a news article about an event, you are going to rely on Twitter. But then whether you are going to write more than one article, I don't have any evidence on the fact that you are going to use the popularity of your previous articles or of the articles published by your competitors about the event.
Thank you. And what you're also pointing to, and I'll recognize Pablo, is that an incredible incentive for the manipulation of the news by manipulating social media activities, which are kind of much easier to do because the numbers are smaller. And so there's a major multiplier and an incentive, and even an economic incentive too, and certainly a policy incentive to do so. And it's probably easy to do. Pablo and then Heather. Pablo, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Eli. Long time no see. Thank you for hosting this. Hi, Julia. This is fabulous work. Can I play devil's advocate for a minute? Twitter is a niche network. Ranks about 17th or so in terms of popularity for social media platforms, and is niche in the sense that it concentrates the attention of people who are very much information seekers. But how much do you think your findings would generalize to other social media platforms which have different cultures of use and different customer base? In particular, for news, we have seen in many parts of the world a rising interest on Instagram, which has a very different culture of usage. And how much do you think, that would affect decision-making differently from Twitter, and issues of, as you said, welfare effects related to this?
So that's a very good point. That's are two different questions in a sense. I am expecting the effect of other social media to be much lower because we do find an overrepresentation of journalists on Twitter. So I think part of the effect is really linked to the fact that journalists, they use Twitter as a news source. And when you look at survey data, it's much less the case for Facebook or for Instagram or for Snapchat. Some people are calling Twitter the social media of journalists, and I guess this is part of the problem. So if we were able to do exactly the same thing, but for example with Facebook, I'm not sure that we will find such a big effect. Now it also means that the welfare implications won't be the same. So if you look at Facebook and if you look at the characteristics of the Facebook users, they look much more like the overall population. So in a sense, it will be less of an issue from a welfare point of view to rely on this signal than to rely on a signal that just comes from a social media that is a niche social media.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. Heather, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I wonder if there is another economic rationale different from the one that Ellie was suggested. Is there a correlation between reliance on Twitter and media with smaller budgets or fewer reporters? Because if they're going to have to rely on secondary sources because they don't have the staff to do more initial investigative or initial reporting, that could also be a reason why they would rely on Twitter, plus some of the rationale that you also described.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. We should have looked at it. We did not, because for now we have like 200 media outlets, and just for a quarter of them, we have information on the size of the newsroom. And it turns out for those for which we have information on the size of the newsroom are also the larger media outlets that tends to publish more their accounts, this kind of stuff. And we cannot really proxy the number of the size of the newsroom by their number of journalists on Twitter, because the involvement of their journalists on Twitter is also of interest per se. But you are right. It would be good to know that, whether when you have less resources, less journalists, you will have a higher tendency to rely on secondary sources and then to use Twitter as a secondary source. One of the things that we did in our previous quantitative work using French data, it was to look at the reliance on copy and paste and whether the media outlets were relying on content produced by their competitors. And in this case, we documented the fact that, so there were like two findings. The first finding was all the media outlets are relying a lot on copying, all of them. Even if you take Le Monde in France. And so I guess if we were doing the same on the US, we would find a lot of copy and paste by the New York Times or the Washington Post. But it's true that those with larger newsroom were also producing more original content. So I guess this is one dimension that we might also find here and that we should definitively try to document.
Thank you. Are there any questions? If I don't see any raised hands, I don't see a raised hand, so I encourage you to.
I see one by Johannes Boer.
Hi, yes, hi, thank you. Hey, really nice, interesting presentation. I was running a few minutes late because I had misplaced my login link, so you may have talked about this. So I apologize if I duplicate something, but let's say if you look at this, you mentioned bias based on information, news that are based on Twitter feeds. Does that implicitly mean that sort of, let's say, Associated Press is not biased, right? I mean, I don't think one could sort of draw that conclusion. But let's for a moment look at this as a portfolio, right? And so newsworthiness is inherently opaque, but there's, for example, timeliness is part of newsworthiness. And one could say that the rational journalist actually just follows one of the basic principles of what is newsworthy by looking at what is sort of happening more or less in real time, and maybe trading off the fact that this is a subgroup of social network users. But if you look at this in the portfolio of different news, right, how strong is that bias that might come in, or is it actually serving the public because they're following this notion of timeliness, which is one of the traditional components of newsworthiness?
Go ahead, Julia.
No, it's not an easy one. I think here, like the first thing is that there are like two different dimensions in terms of bias. The one issue that we have is the bias in terms of content. So it can be like media slant in a sense, but it can also be what you decide or not to cover. The kind of bias I was more like thinking about when talking about like the fact that Twitter is biased, is that if you look at the characteristics of the Twitter users, they are not representative of the overall population. So I guess they are not interested on average in the same topics the overall population is interested in. And this is the main, I think, difference between Twitter and AP. When you are an agency such as AP, you are going to produce every day a set of dispatch, and you are going to try to produce as many dispatch covering as many topics as possible, because you want each media outlet to be able to pick some dispatch in order to target its readership. While on Twitter, a lot of things can happen, and the things that are going to be visible on Twitter, and so also visible to the journalists, are going to be biased by the fact that the characteristics of the Twitter users differ from the characteristics of the overall population.
Thank you. We have Carolina and then Jonathan. So Carolina, please go ahead.
Thank you, Julia, for a very interesting presentation. I just have one observation, which may sound like stating the obvious, but have you considered the fact that platforms such as Twitter enjoy a limited liability regime, and thereby, they're not accountable for manipulation, for fake news, which actually become viral, whereas traditional news outlets, news publishers or broadcasters are accountable. And I can come up with an anecdote from our company. There was a piece of news that became a story that became viral on Facebook, and one of our journalists made up a story for our evening news. Then it came up that he was prosecuted because the story was a fake, and we've actually been sanctioned. So there is this difference that traditional news outlets are accountable and cannot rely on news from social media, because in the end, there is a different liability regime. That's all.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. And I think that's part of the debate, whether the platforms such as Twitter or Facebook should be accountable for fake news, because we all know that they are not, because of some rules that were passed like at the end of the 1990s, so much before the creation of this social media, and they still use that as a kind of a protection. Now, what we decided to do in this article was really to look at everything that was happening on Twitter, and not specifically at fake news, because in a sense, I think the literature is doing like too much about fake news and not trying to understand enough what is happening in terms of the production of real news stories. But I guess if we were to focus on the specific set of fake news within our tweets, we might find something that goes in the direction you just highlighted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Actually, Julia, you've already partially answered my question, but there's maybe something left of it, and it really has to do with the nature of bias. You indicated sort of two separate concepts. One, a bias in the actual topics chosen for coverage, and then one could also imagine bias in the approach to a particular topic, whether it be fake news or some other type of distortion. I mean, as I understand it, your data don't allow sort of examination of the particular content of each story. So it could be that that Twitter prompts a traditional news medium to investigate a story, but to do their own reporting and to come up with their own approach to it, rather than simply amplify whatever there was on Twitter.
That's a very good point. So one of the things we do, and I didn't show for the sake of time, is that we look a little bit at the overall topic. So whether this is about economics, politics, sport, health, this kind of stuff. We did not go further because it's incredibly difficult to measure media slant based on the text on tweets.
I agree. Yeah.
We hardly know how to do that based on the text of news articles that are kind of long enough. We know a little bit, but based on the text of tweets, it's very, very hard. And by the way, it's why all the research that try to look at propagation of like right-wing or left-wing content on social media such as Twitter, what they do in general, they just simply look at whether a politician from the right or a politician from the left get more retweets. They never enter into the content of the tweets. It would be fantastic to be able to do that, but it's really super complicated, just given the nature of the tweet. To give you a sense, is we already produced for our previous research and algorithm to create a cluster of events, a cluster of media articles to determine news stories produced by traditional media outlets. And we thought at the beginning we could simply rely on that to determine events on Twitter. And it turns out to be much more difficult because tweets are too short. So everything is more difficult when you work with tweets than when you work with full text news articles.
Right. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think you are mute, Eli.
My apologies. So we invite other questions. In the meantime, Julia, can you relate to the question that, or to the point that I kind of raised, which is that there's some, based on what you find, incentive to manufacture, to produce social media content in order to amplify it in other media?
That's a very good point. And I think at the end of the day, I hope this won't be the way our results will be interpreted, you know, by some people saying that, oh, it's even more efficient than what we thought. We should bias the news or produce like fake content on social media to try to amplify it and to have more visibility on traditional news media.
And with the point that that we also heard about the liability, that you can do that with a lower risk profile in social media. That's
true. That's entirely true. On this issue of section 230, I think it's 230, this is a big issue in the US, and I think this is a question we should also tackle in European countries, because if you look at the law in European countries such as France, it just relied on what is happening in the US, and we also last year with the Facebook and then Twitter ban of Trump, that the first of all, the ban came too late. And second, it might not be the good solution because like now all the users who were at least faced with different content on Twitter, they moved to other social media where you only have far right users. One of the things we do in the analysis is that we identify bots. It's not super complicated to identify bots among Twitter users because they do not tweet like you and I, and they tweet way too much, even if I also tweet way too much, but I'm not going to be identified as a bot. And at some point, should we drop the bot before running the analysis or not? And then we decided not to do so because the bots are creating some activity, and this activity, in fact, may be then used by traditional media outlets that do not realize that it was not like real Twitter activity, but just bot-generated Twitter activity. And I guess we might see similar phenomena driven by political consideration.
Thank you. So let me follow up with another question, which is, you've done your research on France, and so in some ways I'm be a bit unfair to you to ask you to extend it and extrapolate from it, but you do know the United States quite well. And so what would be, and I know you will have to speculate here, what would be your expectation about that relationship of social media to news coverage and selection?
I'm expecting to find something that is kind of similar. With one of the things that is important here, I guess, one of the main points, in fact, it decided that it varies with the media outlet business model, and the fact that like a newspaper like the New York Times now is getting the majority of its revenues from subscription and no longer from advertising. So historically, to be totally honest, all the media outlets in the US were relying on advertising much more than media outlets in France. In terms of share of their revenues coming from subscription or share of their revenues coming from advertising, which is due to two things. The first thing is that the advertising market is much larger in the US. Like now, I think 0.7% of US GDP, we should be like at 0.25, 0.3% of French GDP. So the advertising market is much higher. Plus the size of the US market is larger than the size of the French one. So historically, you had a larger reliance in the US on ad revenue. And because of that, I would have expected the effect to be even stronger in the US.
Yes.
If you believe my finding, the more you rely on advertising revenue, the more you are going to use Twitter as a signal.
Mm-hmm. Now, within the kind of differentiation that you make between subscription and advertising, within the subscription model, however, you have another incentive structure, and that is of the journalists themselves, who within the news organization get more recognition, promotion, maybe more money, and maybe more job opportunities elsewhere with the number of clicks that they get. So does that, even if the overall organization might be less counting clicks, the journalists and the editors of those journalists do so. So how does that affect your findings?
So I don't have the data on that. I would love to. It's very complicated to collect and to get a sense of whether media outlets are incentivizing journalists depending on the number of clicks obtained by the articles. I have the information for a few media with whom I spent a lot of time. And for example, if you talk to Le Monde, so which is a main daily newspaper in France, now they have all the statistics. And this is what we use basically in our previous research to show the correlation between the number of likes on Facebook and the number of clicks by article. So they have all the information. They no longer provide journalists with the information. They no longer want journalists to be aware of the traffic generated by the article. So it does not mean that journalists have no information. They can always look at number of tweets or number of likes on Facebook, but they want to separate the two because they do not want to incentivize journalists depending on the popularity of an article. And their guess here is to say that some articles are going to do super well on the very long run, to be very influential, even if they do not attract a lot of clicks in the short run. While we know that in other newsroom, you will have, like this is well documented by Angèle Christin, for example, in her books, Click or Pulitzer, you will have a wall where you will have like a real-time stat for each journalist, and you know some award if you do very well at some point of time. So you're right. I am sure that if I were able to get this data, I will find that even for a subscription-based media outlet, we find heterogeneity depending on the kind of incentives you give to your journalist. But this is not data that is easy to collect. This is why you need to go a little bit more qualitative, in my view.
Well, Julia, thank you. I appreciate very much your joining from France with us on your afternoon, late afternoon, and our morning, our noontime. And so I'd like kind of to thank Professor Cagé, who's been here with us. Thank you, and audience, thank you very much. This is the last event for the year 2021. We always kind of take off December so that people have time to do some Christmas and Hanukkah shopping online or offline. So we will reconvene in 2022. And so I'd like to wish you all the best already now for the next year. We'll talk to you soon. And so thank you again, Julia, and thank you, audience.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.